Hi, I'm John Hales, a reporter for the Moab Times Independent newspaper in Moab, Utah. Maybe you know the name of Frank DeAngelis, though in all likelihood you probably don't. But if you can name the two students who made Columbine High School a synonym for school shooting massacres, then you really ought to know the name of Frank DeAngelis. DeAngelis was the principal at Columbine when the shooting happened, as well as for the next 15 years as he faced down the demons of that day in order to help the school and the community heal. DeAngelis was in Moab on the evening of January 19th, 2018, for a community presentation about Columbine and its aftermath. Before his presentation, I had the privilege of spending an hour with DeAngelis for an interview. That interview is presented here. Now, neither here nor in the interview do I use the names of the two students who, on April 20th, 1999, ended the lives of 12 of their fellow students, a teacher, and finally their own, and forever impacted the lives of innumerable others. DeAngelis himself almost never uses their names. I'll let him tell us the reason for that in his own words. But before that, our interview began with me asking DeAngelis how he himself refers to that terrible day, especially since he's strived so hard to erase some of the stigma associated with the school and to make it synonymous with hope, not horror.
Well, I refer to it as a Columbine tragedy.
Okay.
And I really do. And, people say it's the incident or the thing at Columbine, but it was a tragedy. And in my mind, when I do go out and talk, I know what their intent was and I know what happened, but to me it was an act of terrorism,
Right.
And a plan that was not fully carried out, fortunately, or we would have lost a lot more kids
Right.
and staff members.
Yeah. I actually was a teacher at the time of Columbine, and so I remember the shock, and trying to, talk to students who were worried. Is that going to happen here? And it seems like every generation probably has key moments that seem to really change or have an impact on the collective psyche. I think for me, Columbine and 9/11 are the two that stick out. Why did Columbine have that kind of impact? I think I'm not alone.
Right. And it's amazing that you say that, make that comment, because I do probably 45 to 50 speaking engagements a year around the country, in Canada, went to Ireland, and I'm always taken back a little bit when people make that comment. I remember where I was when Columbine happened, and they described exactly where they were. Well, for me, I grew up in a time, I remember where I was when President Kennedy was assassinated. I was in a parochial school and we immediately started praying. I remember when the Challenger exploded.
Yes.
I remember 9/11, getting ready to go to school. And so to be put in that category with others, it had a major impact.
Mm-hmm.
And I think where people are kind of surprised is they really feel that Columbine was the first shooting, and it really wasn't. There were shootings dating back in the States into the 1700s, but I really believe, this is my thought process, I really believe that it's the way the media played it out. That's the reason we're still talking about it, because there were shootings prior, there's been shootings since.
Right.
But it was the first time that I think media did 24/7 coverage. They brought it into our living rooms, and I think that's why people are talking about it. I was just recently in New Jersey, and a young lady came up to me. She was a teacher, and she said, "God, I was in 8th grade, and I remember exactly where we were. We were all scared."
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the thing to come out of it that I get when I do go out and present is people in their minds have this perception it happens at certain places. And if I was to describe to you the type of community Columbine is, they're saying, "Oh my gosh, that's the school I went to, that's the school I teach in, that's the school where my kids go. If it could happen there, it can happen anywhere." And I think that's the message that I share, and not to put fear into people, but unfortunately we need to reach out to everyone to make sure that another Columbine does not happen.
Right. It struck me as I was thinking about and preparing for this that there are adults now who were not alive when Columbine happened. 18 years old.
Right.
So maybe we need to just go through briefly. I mean, we all know there was a tragic school shooting, but just and I know there's so much to say about it.
Right.
But maybe just briefly take us through that day and particularly your actions.
Okay, most definitely. It was a beautiful Colorado spring day, 70 degrees, and I did not start out at Columbine on the morning of. I was at a recognition breakfast for some students that were being honored by the Chamber of Commerce. And so I returned back to Columbine around 9:30, and I was getting ready to go to cafeteria duty. It's one of my favorite activities, going down and sitting and talking to the kids. But I was meeting with the teacher, Kiki Leba, at the time. He was in my office, and I was going to offer him a continuing contract for the upcoming school year, because we were about a little over a month away from graduation and summer vacation starting. Well, my secretary, Susan White, comes in and she said, "Frank, there's been a report of gunfire." And my first thought, this has to be a senior prank. This can't be happening here. Because I had spent 20 years prior. I taught history, I coached football and baseball, and I was in my third year as principal. So this was a place, I was 23 years old when I started. I loved the place. And just good kids, good parental support, great staff. Well, she springs that on us and immediately run out of my office, and Kiki goes down the hallway, and I come out, and my worst nightmare becomes a reality, because probably about 100 yards away, I see a gunman coming towards me with a long gun. And immediately I go into this mode I found out later was fight, flight, and freeze. And everything just kind of slowed down, and I heard glass breaking behind me as shots were being fired. And I thought I moved very calmly, while in actuality what Kiki stated is I ran right towards a gunfire. And what I realized later is there were girls that were coming out of the gymnasium to go to a physical education class, coming out of the locker room, and so I knew immediately what I had to do was protect them, because they were coming in harm's way. So ran towards them, the gunman is pursuing us, and then we're trapped in a little hallway, and I shared this story in my presentations, and whether you believe in God or not, there were external forces helping that day. And when I tell people this, they're just kind of chills, so to speak, and I still get chills talking about it. But anyway, the girls are trapped, we're trapped, the gunman's coming, shots are being fired, and I go to pull the door, it's locked. And I reach in my pocket, I have a set of keys, 35 keys, so I reach in my pocket, I pull out a key, and it opened the door on the first try. And I tried that, I can't tell you how many times after 15 years later, never was able to do it. And so that one door, that one key, one door probably saved us. And the thing that was so difficult for me, and a lot of survivors guilt even 19 years later, almost 19 years later, Dave Sanders, a dear friend of mine, if he would have stayed in the cafeteria, I wouldn't be doing this interview. And I found out later that he came upstairs, trying to save kids, but as he came down the hallway, the gunman stopped momentarily coming after and turned around and shot Dave in the back of the head. Unfortunately, he later died 3 hours later before the paramedics got to him. So from there, I got the girls into the gymnasium area. I put them we went to a little storage area, and I told the girls that I needed to go check to make sure if it was safe outside, because we had heard reports. There were so many rumors out there. There were snipers on the roof, and I said I did not want to put them in harm's way, but I locked them in the door, and I said, "I have a key, I'll get you back in." So I went outside, and the police had started arriving, and I told them I had to go back in and get the girls, so they made sure I had cover, and I went and got the girls and brought them out, and I was going to go back in, and at that point, they said, no one else is going in. And the thing that saddens me, and when I do this presentation, is I think of the protocol that was in place back on April 20, 1999, and what we're doing now. It's changed so drastically. On that day, we had an officer on site that was engaged with gunfire, and with the two gunmen, they were upstairs, or standing on a staircase firing down at the police who was standing outside, but the police were told they could not go into the building until SWAT got there. Unfortunately, by the time SWAT went in, it was about 55 minutes, and 13 lost their lives. But, I say this, and people kind of look at me strangely when I said, we're fortunate from the standpoint that 13 lost their lives, but they had placed 2 propane tanks in the building, and their intent was never to come into the building's 2 killers. the building was bombs were set to explode at about 11:20, and when people started running out, they were going to shoot people. Well, the bombs never exploded, and so from that standpoint, we're lucky because there could have been 600 or 700 people that died on that day. So.
I notice you refer to them as the gunmen and avoid using their names.
Right.
Is that a conscious decision?
Yes, it is.
Why is that?
Because it was probably a month later, I had to watch what they refer to as a basement tape. These two did not wake up on the morning of the 20th and just said, it's having a bad day, let's go shoot up the school or blow up the school. It's something that they had planned out meticulously for over a year, what they were going to do, detail by detail. And one of the comments they made is they said, we're going to live forever, that we are going to be legends. And the thing that I challenge people to do is if I was to go into a place and say, give me names associated with Columbine High School, most would be able to name the two killers.
Sure.
But they would be hard-pressed to name the 12 or 12 students in Mr. Sanders. And so the thing that worries me now is, as you pointed out earlier, there are kids that were not even born that are making reference to the two. And I think it's the way that the media portrayed them, stating that these were two outcasts that were bullied and picked on. And even though what they did was horrible, but they were standing up for everyone like me that gets picked on in school. And that was the farthest thing from the truth. And so what worries me is there have been 74 instances where students have made reference to the two killers of Columbine as motivation or as cult heroes. And there's been 5 instances where people that actually carried out school shootings made a visit to Columbine as motivation to carry out their act. So I don't want those two to be remembered for that hideous act that they did. Now, did I forgive them? Yes, but I can't forgive the act that they did, and that's the reason I don't mention it.
Sure. I was going to ask this a little later in the interview, but I'll go ahead and address it now. Right after the incident, how did you think of them, of those two that perpetrated the tragedy? How did you think of them? How did you view them right after that?
Well, this is a big part of my presentation. There was so much anger and hate built up in my heart. And I was angry because I went to 13 memorial services. I used to go to Craig Hospital to visit Patrick Ireland and Anne Marie Hall Coulter and Sean Graves and Richard Castaldo, who 2 of the 4 are paralyzed from the waist down, and Patrick Ireland's partially paralyzed, and Sean Graves, walks with a limp. And I was angry.
Sure.
But my faith is important to me, and it was a couple of days after the tragedy that I went down to the church. I'm a Catholic, and the priest said, you were spared for a reason. You should have died that day. And he said, but now you need to rebuild that community. So there was the challenge to go back, and I had the support of the superintendent and the school board president saying, you can stay as long as you want, and we hope that you help rebuild this community. But what I noticed is I was so angry and mad all the time and bitter, and I said, if I really am going to rebuild this community, I can't bring this attitude in. And so a friend of mine said, Frank, something I learned a long time ago is you could hate the sin but not the sinners. And so I had to forgive. Now, and I understand completely, there are families that don't agree with me because they're going to say, I can never forgive those 2 for what they did. They took my child, and denied me an opportunity to see them, my fathers walk their daughters down the aisle or hold their first grant. And I said, I understand completely. But I said, for me to lead that school to where it needed to be, I couldn't have that hatred and anger pent up inside me. So that's where I got to where I was.
So how did that happen for you? I've experienced in my life a significant moment where I was filled with forgiveness for someone that I never thought I would be able to forgive, and it happened in an instant, surprisingly. After wanting to forgive for so long, how did it happen for you? How did that process work?
Well, again,
or was it a process?
It was, and it was my faith, and I kept believing, and And I don't mean, when I go out and present, I don't mean to preach, but I said, it worked for me. It was my faith and counseling that allowed me to fulfill what Father Ken had asked me to do to rebuild that community. And so it was the support system in place. And the more I got involved, the more I said, Jesus Christ died on the cross for us, and he forgave the people that did that. And I said, geez, who am I not to forgive? And it was tough because we had a community that was torn apart, grief.
Sure.
We had a community where there was a gentleman who brought crosses, 15 crosses, and placed them on Rebel Hill, and there were some family members who lost their kids and cut down the 2 crosses. They did not want the 15 or 2 to be associated, and so it was a tough time. And there was a period of time where there was a pastor down at the Lutheran Church in the community that did a memorial service for Kleball, and he ended up, the community was outraged, and they ran him out of the community.
Wow.
So, I saw the best of people, but at the same time, I saw people that were not being as Christian-like. But once again, I never, even though they were kids in my school, even though Mr. Sanders was a dear friend, I never lost a child in the manner in which they did, so I would never judge anyone for how they felt. But I knew for me, if I was going to continue, I had to forgive.
I've read somewhere that you talk about, or at least it was put in this article, one of the reasons you stayed was a sense of spiritual imperative. Is it the counsel you received from your spiritual advisor, your
Yes.
priest? Is that what you're referring to?
Most definitely.
Okay.
And I made a commitment originally, because it was the day after the 21st of April. I had to meet with students and parents and government officials, and I made a commitment. I said, it's going to be tough. It's going to be a tough journey. And I never color-coded saying, tomorrow you're going to wake up and everything's going to be fine. I never did. And I said, it's going to be a tough journey, and people are going to tell you that these wounds or scars that you experienced will eventually heal. I said, these scars that we experienced yesterday are going to be with us for the rest of our life.
Sure.
But I said, we can walk this journey together. And I made a commitment and a promise, and part of the reason I was able to make that commitment was I met with the school board and superintendent prior to my meeting, because I said, I'll do whatever you need me to do. If you need to have me resign, I'll do that. And they said, no, you were the principal, you're going to continue to stay as long as you want. And so I knew going in that at least I would have their support. So when I met with the kids and the parents, I said, I promise I will be here until the class of 2002 graduates. They were freshmen at the time.
Right.
And I said, we'll get through this together. Well, it's getting close to their senior year. It was August of 2001. We're getting ready to start an upcoming school year. And I took my dog and started reflecting. And those words that Father Ken had placed in my head, prior, saying you need to rebuild that community. I said, the job's not done. So then I made a bold statement that I said I was going to stay until every kid who was in an elementary school graduated, which took us through the class of 2012. So I said, I just made a commitment for at least another 10 years. And it was interesting because I was getting ready to retire in 2012, and a parent comes up and said, Frank, you can't. I said, well, no, I can. They said, no, you don't understand. My kid was in the first year of a 2-year preschool program, so you need to stay. And so I did. And
I was going to ask why you stayed those 2 extra years.
And they said,
that's why.
And the parent said, you can't. My kid was only in the first year, and he doesn't graduate. And I said, okay. And so I stayed to 2014, which made it 15 years after the tragedy. So when I left, every kid who was impacted, whether they were from preschool to kindergarten on, I was able to hand their diploma and give them the support. So I felt that I had fulfilled that promise.
I would imagine making that promise, though, it would be difficult for anyone who is in that kind of traumatic situation to stay and be so continually reminded.
Right.
I can't imagine. So I would think that fulfilling that promise came at some personal cost to yourself?
Yes.
Can you talk about
Sure,
that?
it did. I had my faith. I got into counseling right away because my mom worked for a Vietnam veteran, and he called me the day after. He said, Frank, you're going to be pulled in so many different directions. If you don't help yourself, you can't help anyone else. And so I got into counseling right away, and it was fortunate. The counselor I was with was also a member of my parish, so I got the spiritual piece of it plus the mental health piece of it. And it really helped. And where I made a mistake is I did a pretty good job of doing taking care of the students, the parents, staff members, community members, but I did a poor job taking care of my family because my wife, I was married for 18 years, I had a stepson who graduated from Columbine in 1993, and then I had a daughter, Haley, who was a sophomore at a neighboring high school. And if I had to do it all over again, and I share this in my presentation, I got myself the help I needed, and I should have been more demanding of my family. Because when I told my wife, I said, we need to go in for, I don't need it. You're the one that went through that. You're the one that screwed up, and we don't need it. And so it got to the point that she said, when are we going to stop talking about Columbine and this type of thing? And when are you going to get over it? And I wish I would have been more persistent and said, you don't understand what I'm going through. And as time went on, instead of coming home each night, for her saying, are we going to talk about Columbine again? Are we going to do this? I waited until they were sleeping, came home after, I stayed at work until they were sleeping, and I'd leave before they got up in the morning to avoid it. And, that led to a divorce after 18 years. And one of the things, like I said, if I had to do it all over again, I would have been more involved in their lives as far as bringing them in to see what I was going through, the post-traumatic, and why I was aloof, and why I had all this survivor's guilt. And so it took its toll on me personally from that standpoint, but it was a wake-up call, and I do share that information when I go out and present, whether it be to police officers or school officials. It was a hard lesson to learn, and unfortunately it cost me a marriage, and it cost me a relationship with my daughter that I'm still trying to work on now, that didn't realize the impact it had until about 3 years ago. She called up very angry, and we haven't talked since. And I've been trying to solve it.
Oh, gosh. You talk a lot about faith, and I had gathered from what I had researched, that you were a man of faith. I was going to ask you about that. I don't think anyone would be blamed if the tragedy had caused a loss of faith completely.
Right.
That for you, that's clearly not true. Did it ever cause a crisis of faith?
Yes.
It did.
It did. I can remember after seeing the gunman, after seeing those girls, after identifying a kid whose face, Lance Kirkland, whose face was shot off, and amazingly he survived. They wanted me to identify the kid because they said he wasn't going to make it, and miraculously he survived. After seeing that, after going to the elementary school and having to tell the parents that there's a good chance their kids lost their life in my building, I can remember going, not to my house because the police said, we're afraid that there may be others out there that may be targeting you. Do you have a place to stay? So I went to my brother's house. I went to my house to get some clothing for the next day, but then we went to my brother's house, and I can remember lying in bed and saying, God, how could, I'm a person of faith. I've been, faithful and well, but how could this happen? And I did exactly what you're talking about, question some things, but it was, again, Father Ken who said, Frank, you got to live by faith and not by sight. I mean, and that's a tough one when, you're burying these kids and their lives are cut short, but I had to believe that, God's got a plan, and, I think it's Proverbs says, man has a plan, but God carries out, man has plans, a course of action, but God carries out the plan, and I had to believe in that. And I just put my trust in it, and it really, I did not understand at the time the importance it would have, because I was being vilified, I was being judged, I had 8 lawsuits named against me, and it took everything in my power not to fire back, but I kept going back to my faith, and I actually told some people, I said, my judgment, you can judge me, but my judgment's not coming on the face of the earth, it's coming afterwards. And that was that mindset that allowed me to continue to be the principal of Columbine.
You mentioned having to look at a student's face, just now, identifying that. I wanted to ask about looking at a different student in the face with the gunman that you encountered when the gun was aimed at you.
Right.
Did you, and I imagine nothing conscious at the moment, but as you look back on that, what do you remember about seeing in his face, in his eyes? What
I
was
don't
there?
remember, and to be honest, it was a distance away.
Okay.
But what I do remember, it was a long gun, and it was amazing that when you're put in a situation like this, and I talk to law enforcement agents and people that face those circumstances more frequently, and everything is magnified, and the barrel of the gun looked about the size of a cannon.
Yes.
And I remember the strobe lights were going off, and they just they just resonate in my head, but it was amazing that I was able to shut off the fire alarm system. That sound, I blocked it out. And it's probably good because I was able to concentrate on those girls. And it was amazing what your mind does. And I still envision that. And that was very tough for me when I had to go back in the building, because I had to start school 8 weeks before everyone else, and I was in the building with construction workers. But it took me a long time to walk down that hallway without getting nauseous or envisioning that gunman. And that's where my counselor came in and he said, Frank, you got to replay that, at the time, the CD in your mind or the DVR in your mind, that instead of walking out of the hallway seeing the gunman coming towards you, instead of walking out of the hallway stepping over students dying, you got to envision them living their life. And so I started envisioning the Lauren Townsend playing volleyball or the Isaiah Scholes high-fiving me, and when I started envisioning that, it helped me to continue, and this was all part of the healing process for me to continue to be the principal. And so it worked out, but it had tough times. I mean, I can remember going to this Colorado baseball, Rockies baseball game on July 4th. I went to the fireworks display. What a big mistake. I was unprepared, and I had a meltdown. I mean, I got in a fetal position, I'm shaking, I'm crying, and that's when I realized, what about post-traumatic stress disorder. And then I started thinking, oh my gosh, I really got a task ahead of me, because there's going to be certain things that trigger the emotion of our kids and staff members. So in addition to doing that, I had to make sure that trying to look ahead is something I was never prepared for.
Going back, touching on the again on the promise that you made to stay,
Right.
and you explained why you made that and when and how that all happened. Were there times, I imagine there were, but maybe not, were there times that you wish you hadn't made that promise?
No, and I really believe this. People look at me and say, "You're dumber than I thought." There were times, and I gotta tell, and you're gonna look at this, and people are gonna see this, and say, "Oh my God, this fake thing." But there were times that, when there were other things that happened. We had students commit suicide that were there, that they said they could no longer deal with it. And there were additional tragedies that occurred, and threats made upon the school, and everybody kept saying, Frank, you stayed longer than you needed to. You don't know anybody. You did what you had to do. All you should have did was stay a year. And I kept thinking, and there were some nights I went home saying, oh dear gosh, but I kept thinking that I lived through the worst of it. I survived. I can get through this.
Sure.
And there were times I'd go over to the church, and they had a 24-hour adoration chapel, and I'd just sit in that chapel with God and just say, God, I know, show me the way. This is tough times. And I never regret being at Columbine before or after. And, I don't know, maybe I need to be evaluated for my mental stability, but I think the one thing that people state, that I was a calming force for all of them, and that I stayed and I represented things, and people said I was strength, but the thing they didn't realize is I was struggling too, but I provided the support that I needed, again, in order to help them. And it takes me back to that day when my friend said that you got to take care of yourself before you take care of someone else. And every time I get on a plane, I think, about that statement when the flight attendant comes on and says, you know, if for whatever reason you lose cabin pressure, that mask is going to come down, and before you help the person, your child next to you, put it on yourself first. And I think of that, and that's really, I think, is a good analogy of what I do.
I can't imagine the number of times you've probably thought through the years, maybe it's diminished, you know, now, but that you and others would have asked, you know, what could we have done? Where did we go wrong? Especially when the basement tapes that you mentioned, they said, you know, to the parents, they talked to the parents and said, there's nothing you guys could have done to prevent any of this, there's nothing anybody could have done. So, did you find an answer?
Yeah. And the one thing that I can say is there have been lessons learned, and people always say, well, Frank, how can you say that? There's still school shootings. I mean, there was Virginia Tech, Sandy, Chardon, Red Lakes. But I said, how many have been stopped because of things we're doing differently now? And I think back prior to Columbine tragedy, we were all acting as separate entities. So at the school, there was a rioting. Well, we dealt with that. Sat down with the teacher, down with the counselor, sat down with the family of one of the young men that was a shooter, and we dealt with it. But the police didn't get involved. The judicial system didn't get involved. Well, what was happening in the community is there was a hit list out there that was turned over to the police. Mm-hmm. The police didn't share that with us. There was a young man that worked at the pizzeria, manager, and these two were exploding pipe bombs. That information was never shared. So the point being, if we would have all gotten together saying, oh my gosh, this is our community, these are our kids, and put all of these pieces of the puzzle on a table and start putting them together, people would have said, oh my gosh, here's some red flags. And we weren't doing that. And it's not to exonerate us from any blame. I think anyone who, you know, worked with those kids, whether it be teachers, principal, people within the community, their friends are saying, did we miss something? And I see both sides, but I really believe after watching those basement tapes, that especially Harris, he was a psychopath. He was evil. He had people fooled. And if you look at some of the people that were serial killers, I mean, Ted Bundy's and others, I really believe their mindset was such that they did not value life, and he idolized Adolf Hitler, and he talked about survival of the fittest and why people should die, and he justified this thought, that he felt it was natural selection, and, you know, and they placed this in their mind, and so sometimes you almost have to just say it's pure evil, you know, but the thing that weighs on my mind, and you brought it up and you mentioned it, I saw pictures of these two kids when they were young, you know, and they were in soccer uniforms and smiles from ear to ear and teeth missing, you know, these innocent kid like the other 2,000 at Columbine. And I saw the guys pointing a gun at me, and I said, what went wrong? Did we let him down? And I don't know. You know, and I know Mrs. Klebold wrote a book wondering what did they do as parents? Did they miss something? And so there's always that second guessing after the fact. But sometimes it's just pure evil in the world. I think that's what we were confronted with.
And that was one of the things that I wanted to talk about, because it seems like there are, well, more than two different issues. There's many issues with this whole subject, but you've got the issue of addressing, you know, what to do in the event of a crisis, or how to prevent one. You know, and we can implement strategies. We can cooperate better. We can implement security systems and emergency management plans, or what have you. Those, from one perspective, seem to be treating maybe a symptom of a deeper problem. How do we treat the cause, in your mind? What is the cause, and how do we treat that?
I agree with you. I think a lot of times you put surveillance cameras in a building, you put metal detectors if schools go to that, and it's a false sense of security. What is the root of the problem? and what is causing this. And one of the things that really bothers me, because I get a call almost instantaneously when there's another shooting, and get my input, and they want to talk about gun control, and I said, the politicians that argue that, but what bothers me is when there are schools and school districts that are talking about cutting funding for mental health, because these kids now are facing so many issues, and can we identify and help them? And I think the other thing that we have to do as a community, and it needs to be reinforced by parents, community members, schools, the members of the community, about these kids, of just having someone to turn to. Because I can't help but wonder, did those two from Columbine share their thoughts with their friends, and their friends saying, well, they'll never do it, and type of things. And I can't tell you the number of school shootings that have been foiled because some kids said something's not right, and they were empowered. There were systems set up in which they could share this concern with others, and that's what we need to have in place. And I think parents need to be parents, as far as knowing that I got to be involved in my kid's life, and I got to see what they're doing on their phones and here. And I had parents saying, "It's not. I can't do that because I'm violating their First Amendment rights." And I said, "Time out. You're parents." And when a parent came to me and said, "I think my kid is involved in drugs," I said, "Have you been in their room?" "No, I can't do that. That's violating their right." I said, "You're the parent." And they said, "Well, even more so, they got a padlock on their door." And I said, "That in itself should be a red flag." And I said,
Sure.
"Take the door off the hinges." And it's things like that these kids are reaching out. And I use this statement all the time that the two from Columbine are these people that do these hideous acts, do not come out of their mother's womb hating.
Right.
What happened from the time they were born to the time they carried out these acts? Something happened, and what can we do to maybe prevent some of that?
Now, as we talk about, individuals, families, schools, societies, other institutions. Now, as a journalist, I'm not going to let the media off the hook. What is the media's role and responsibility in that whole scheme?
Well, see, and I think what the media has learned since Columbine has been monumental, how they're reporting things, because we opened up this conversation about how the media shared everything. But one of the things that worries me that the media does, and I know they're doing it, reporting what's happening, but when they continually show tapes of these two and their actions, I got in an argument with, and I can't remember, it was Diane Sawyer who did the interview with Mrs. Klebold. The interview was good, there was a lot of information, but at the same time, they played videotapes for about 15 minutes of these two gunmen at the firing range shooting a bowling pin, talking about what it was going to feel like when that bullet went through the kid's brain. They're airing this on TV, and they're showing about, this is what we're going to do, we're going to blow up the school. And I'm thinking, there are some other kids that are struggling right now, and they see this. You're providing a template, and not that they can't go to the internet and see it, but when you constantly do it. We just had a situation in Colorado. It was a domestic violence situation. The police officers had body cams on. They went to help someone who was mentally disturbed. They tried to help him. When they returned to help him, he killed one officer and injured 4 others. Well, devastating, and the policeman killed him. But what I disagreed with what the media was doing is they were actually playing the tapes from the body cams over and over again and carrying on the conversation between the police officers and the others. And I said, why would you do that? There are people out there saying, oh my God, look, this guy just got all this fame and publicity, and that's what worried me about the Columbine thing. These two reached out and they said, we are going to be known, we will come back and haunt people, and they were prophetic by saying that, because they're still talking about those two. And that's what worries me, and that's the role the media can say. And I think there's a piece that I participated in, it was by Time Magazine, and Anderson Cooper said, we so many times glorify the killers and the names, but we don't the victims.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I'm not going to do that.
I've heard him say that.
Yeah, that's what we need to do.
I mean, so many things probably, but maybe distill it down to the one or two most significant, most important things that we learn from Columbine, from the tragedy.
I think the most important thing is on any given day, it could happen that no one is immune. And I know I get asked to go into schools, I get asked to go into communities to tell people, because they're saying, well, it happens other places, it can't help it here. And it's not that you're trying to be the bearer of bad news or frighten people, but it is our world. And by not talking about it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. And so I think we need to be involved in, to lose another life is one too many. You know, they're kids. And we need to make sure that we're in a situation that we're protecting our kids, and that communities do everything in our power to reach out to the kids. And we need to be involved in their lives. And I think 19 years ago, the technology that was available to those kids, and what it is right now, I think they need us more than anything. You know, that, and the other thing I think we need to realize is Columbine happened, and I think people are saying, oh gosh, schools are not safe. Schools are still very safe. When you look at the number of homicides that occur on a daily basis, and the ones that actually happen in school, it's a small number. But I think it's our responsibility as adults to do everything we can to protect our kids, which is our most precious commodity.
Contrast that. What should we have learned but haven't yet?
That's a good question. I think, you know, we're doing things differently now with drills and things of that nature. I think every time there's a school shooting, there's advocates on both sides for stronger gun laws and others that are not. But the thing that we have not learned is that there are kids crying out for help, and we need to make sure that we have the resources to provide that help. And when they talk about cutting funding for mental health and programs, that bothers me. And you mentioned earlier, if you spend $1 million on a surveillance camera, people can walk in and say, yeah, our money was well spent. But you have programs out there, people, it's not as concrete, but they're valuable. And if you can identify these kids and have the support of the parents saying, your kids are crying out for help, we need to get them the help. And I don't see that necessarily happening all the time.
It's a slow lesson.
Exactly.
I know you had a practice of writing to the families every year around April 20th, calling parents on the birthdays of their deceased children. Do you still do that, or is that something you said?
No, I do.
You do?
I not on the birthdays, but I send letters inviting them to come to the school, because I do a moment of silence on the 20th in the library, and then I call each of them. And each year it varies. You know, each year, last year I think 7 or 8 of the families picked up and had a conversation, because I made them a promise. They kept saying, you know, with time you're going to forget about our kids. And I said, we'll never forget about your kids. And I make you that promise, I will never forget about it. And when I go out and do presentations, I start with the picture of each of them and read their name. And when I end my presentation, there's a video in which it displays the names of the kids. It's a placard that's in the library at Columbine. And I said, I will make you a promise. People will know who your kids were, that they did not die in vain. And so I made that commitment.
And I think as the promise that you kept to stay at Columbine, you're pretty good at keeping that kind of commitment.
Yeah.
So, are there things from that day that you've spoken to spiritual advisors, you've spoken to counselors, family, colleagues. Are there still things from that day that you hold that you've not told anyone?
I think God, I'm pretty open. I mean, it is interesting though, there are times that I'm not withholding information, I just don't remember it. And just recently, my brother and I had a conversation, and my brother actually showed up down at Leewood Elementary School, and he was telling me stuff. I said, that didn't happen. He said, yeah, it did. And so I think it does. Your mind kind of blocks things out, and there's times that I meet with students or see students somewhere, and we start talking, and I find out stuff that happened that I didn't even know, and they said, do you remember this? Or they'd say, Mr. D, do you remember talking about this? And there's times that I think your mind does things to protect you.
Sure.
And there's times then it's brought out in the open. And so I'm smart enough to realize when things aren't going right that it's time to talk to someone. And I never get to the point saying I don't need anyone. I've been in 6 car accidents in the month of April. And every April I go meet with my counselor.
So it is still very much a rough
Very
time.
much, and just recently, within the past year, I received a phone call from San Bernardino when that one teacher was killed by the estranged husband and the poor little kid.
Yes.
Also, both unfortunately died. And then recently with the shootings at the Dallas church, I get a phone call to just help out and offer support. And even though different location, even though a different period of time, different circumstances, it takes me back to April 20th.
Sure.
And that's when I need to talk to someone to help me get through what I need to get through.
Yeah.
So.
I hesitate to. I'm a little reluctant to ask this because I don't want to put you in a position of an uncomfortable position that conflicts with what your spiritual beliefs are, and
Right.
But I know that you are called upon quite a bit to help others in these terrible situations. I'm not quite. I've been thinking about the question for a while, and I still haven't quite figured out how to formulate it. But the fact that you went through some pretty significant. You suffered a lot.
Right.
Yet that has allowed you to help others maybe avoid some pitfalls or through the same kinds of situations. Don't want to use the word savior.
Right.
But do you see, I don't know if you see where I'm getting at for sure, but do you see that you were called upon to go through something absolutely horrific,
Well,
so that you could help others?
it's so ironic because Pastor Dick Pacheco and I just had this conversation over a cup of coffee and tea at a little diner on Main Street. And we said, we're both sitting here for a reason. God brought us here. Because a friend of his, a friend of mine, Ray Jamsey, played high school ball with him. And Dick was talking to his wife Connie, and then Ray's wife Susan, and Ray said, you need to meet Frank DeAngelis. And Dick's saying, well, who's Frank DeAngelis? And we're sitting here sharing our story, and I said, when things happen that day, I could have very easily have died, and I didn't. And I was spared for a reason, and as a result of that, people are saying, Frank, why do you subject yourself to get on a plane 45 different times, or every time someone calls and you have to relive that? And I said, God has a plan for me. And it's not that I'm anyone special, that I'm not a psychiatrist or things like that, but I lived through this. And I think back, would I have had this platform if I wasn't the principal at Columbine High School? And I can't answer that, but because I was there, I could walk in somewhere and say, trust me, it looks dim now, but I'm living proof 5 years from now, 10 years from now, it's going to be a tough journey, but you'll be able to survive. And I was given that platform, and I make this promise, and I will make it tonight, that as long as I can walk and talk, I'm going to continue to share my message, because I really felt that was my calling to do it. Not that I'm a savior, but I just felt that I could help others, and if I can do that, I'm going to continue to do it until I can no longer walk and talk. So that's where I am.
That's. I said that I wanted to ask a question that no one has asked before.
Okay.
So I don't know if I've done that yet or not.
Yes.
So okay, well I'm hoping I've got an ace in the hole.
Okay,
right?
I'm anxious to hear this
So
one.
I had read someone's account of that day, and when you ushered those students into a storage closet, as you mentioned, and you know, had them, you know, locked them there and said, "Don't come out, I'll be back for you," and you gave them a password.
Right.
And the person who was recalling this indicated that maybe she was a little vague on what the password word was, but she said it was oranges in the newspaper. Was that the password?
I think it was, and the person
Where did it come from?
The person you're referring to is Aaron Flynn.
Yes, correct.
Aaron Flynn Hernandez, dear friend, and we talk all the time. And it's so funny, it almost made the moment bearable for a second, because we were in a state of shock.
Sure.
And they're in there, and all of a sudden, I have 30 girls, and I said, okay, I promise I'm going to come back. You don't let anyone in.
Yeah.
And they said, so we need a secret password. And so all these girls, I mean, they're saying this and this, and we all started to laugh for a second. And someone said, Orange said, I said, that's fine. Well, as I'm leaving, we don't need a password because I had a key to open the door. And so when I get together with them, I'm laughing, but it kind of eased the moment. But it was, Orange, and I don't remember, but there were so many girls, and like girls, I said, girls, just be quiet. I'll be back for you, and that was it.
Sure.
And so it was.
Wow. Okay.
I hadn't been asked that question.
Oh, yes. Yes, I'm being motioned. It is time to end. I'll be in the audience this evening,
Oh, great.
of course, to
And
see the
then if you got
presentation. I'm
anything-
very much looking forward to it.
Well, I gave you kind of a preview.
Okay, yeah, well, that's, I appreciate that.
And then, and the important thing too, just finally,
Yes.
I think the question that you asked that's important, it'll be a major theme tonight, is as community members, as educators, reaching out to those kids that are on the fringe. And I share this story, and I kind of end my presentation with it, that originally I'd walk through the hallways and kids would tell me, oh, Columbine is great, we're rebels, we're blue, silver, we're rebels. But there were kids out there that weren't feeling part of that.
Right.
And I went to the smoking pit and the skate park, and I went over and I said, guys, what are you doing? And they said, Mr. D, do you even know our name? And luckily I did. And they said, we don't feel a part of your school. That those kids at your school don't even want us. And I made them a promise. And I met with them and I said, then you need to come to an assembly. And I'm going to leave it at that, and you're going to see my assembly.
I am going to say, just in you saying that, I saw another parallel, but I'll just leave it there.
Okay. You'll know what I'm talking about tonight when you see the assembly and the difference you can make with kids feeling good about it.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening. You can find the article written about DeAngelis' presentation later that night by going to moabtimes.com and in the search box type Columbine.